Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is October 25th. On this day in 1994, in Union, South Carolina, a 23-year-old mother named Susan Smith came running up a driveway crying for help. Her voice trembled as she told a story that would soon make headlines across the country. A man, she said, had carjacked her at a red light, forced her out of her Mazda, and sped away while her two boys, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex, were still strapped in their car seats. Within hours, Union County deputies and state investigators were out on the roads with flashlights. Helicopters hovered over dark fields. And as dawn broke, a mother's tearful face would be on every television in America. Today, we're talking about the Susan Smith case, a story of a carjacking that turned into something much, much darker. Let's get started. It was October 25th, 1994, when Susan Smith told investigators that she'd stopped at a red light at the intersection of Monarch Mills Road and Highway 49 when a stranger, a black man, maybe in his 30s, jumped into the car with a gun, ordered her to get out, and drove off with her children. It was every parent's nightmare, and the news spread like wildfire. By sunrise, the Associated Press and CNN had picked it up. Within 24 hours, missing posters showed the faces of Michael and Alex Smith, two little boys with blonde hair and round cheeks, under the word abducted. In front of the courthouse, cameras captured Susan's emotional plea. "My children wanted me. They needed me. Please bring them home." The press called it the carjacking that broke America's heart. Volunteers flooded in from neighboring counties, bringing coffee, flashlights, and faith that the boys were still alive. It was the kind of story that made strangers feel like neighbors, and for 9 long days, a nation waited for a miracle. From the start, the search moved fast. Union deputies blocked roads and drained small ponds. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division joined the effort. The FBI set up an incident command center at the Armory. But inside those conference rooms, the story was beginning to fray. Investigators reconstructed the supposed carjacking scene and noticed something odd. The traffic light where Susan said she stopped wouldn't have turned red unless another car had been coming to enter the intersection. But Susan had insisted that the road was empty. It was a small inconsistency, but it grew. Detectives also began to notice that her timeline kept shifting by a few minutes each time she retold it. Some details changed entirely. And while Susan's TV appearances stirred sympathy nationwide, her affect in interviews with police veered from hysterical to eerily calm. One detective later said, quote, "It was as if she was reading from a script she didn't quite believe anymore," end quote. Still, they searched on. What else could they do? Helicopters flew low over lakes and volunteer divers swept coves and boat ramps. This went on for 9 days, until the morning of November 3rd, 1994, when Sheriff Howard Wells asked Susan to come in one more time. They sat in a small room at the Union County Sheriff's Office. Wells spoke quietly and even prayed with her. Then, looking across the table, he said the words that changed everything. "Susan, it's time." And that's apparently all it took. Through tears, she confessed. There was no carjacker. There never had been. That night, Sheriff Wells faced the cameras himself. His voice shook as he announced that Susan Smith had been arrested for the murders of her two little boys. The next morning, divers went down into John D. Long Lake. Beneath the dark water, they found the Mazda RX-7 with the doors sealed and the windows rolled up. Inside, the small bodies of Michael and Alex were still strapped into their car seats, hanging upside down. One diver later testified that when his light hit the window, he saw a tiny hand pressed against the glass. The scene would haunt South Carolina forever. When prosecutors released Susan Smith's handwritten confession, the letters seemed to shift between guilt and justification. She wrote about depression, about feeling unwanted and hopeless, and being, quote, in a black cloud, end quote. She claimed that she had planned to kill herself too, but lost her nerve after the car rolled into the water. But investigators were already uncovering a larger, more complicated picture, one that included financial strain, tension in her marriage, and an affair that had recently ended. At the center of that story was a local man, Tom Findlay. Days before the murders, he had written Susan a letter gently breaking up with her. His words were kind but clear. Quote, "I love you, Susan, but I'm not ready for children," end quote. When prosecutors read that letter aloud in court, they let the subtext hang in the air. They argued that Susan's desperation for his affection and her fear of losing him were the emotional triggers that led to the drownings. The trial opened in July 1995, barely 9 months after the confession. Solicitor Tommy Pope led the state's case, calling witnesses who walked jurors through the evidence and the timeline. The defense, led by Judy Clark and David Bruck, two of the most respected capital defenders in America, didn't deny what Susan had done. Instead, they argued why. They painted her as a deeply unstable young woman who had been shaped by trauma. She'd lost her father to suicide as a young child and had been molested by her stepfather as a teen. And in her 20s, her marriage had crumbled, leaving her isolated and spiraling into depression. Clark said in her closing argument, quote, "She was a broken soul, but even a broken soul is still a human one," end quote. After 9 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for barely 2 hours before finding Susan Smith guilty of murder. Then came the sentencing phase, the choice between death or life in prison. On July 28, 1995, the jury returned with a decision: life in prison. They rejected the death penalty, a verdict that stunned many in the gallery, but perhaps reflected a belief that the ultimate punishment wouldn't heal what was already destroyed. In South Carolina, that sentence meant eligibility for parole after 30 years. Long after the trial ended, the story's ripples kept spreading. The lake where the Mazda was found became a grim landmark. Mourners left flowers by the water. Reporters returned on anniversaries. And a year later, tragedy struck again when 7 people, including 4 children, drowned after their vehicle accidentally slid off of the same ramp during a visit to the memorial. The community built a fence after that, trying to reclaim some measure of peace. But the case also forced a harder conversation about race, media, and the way narrative spread. Susan's false description of her carjacker as a black man had triggered fear across Union County and beyond, leading to roadblocks, searches, and suspicions of innocent residents. In later years, columnists would point out how quickly the lie was believed and how deeply the stereotype it invoked had been ingrained. It was one of the lasting scars that the case left behind. In November 2024, 30 years after that night, Susan Smith appeared before a South Carolina parole board via video feed from Leith Correctional Institution. Her hair had gone gray, her voice was quiet. She said that she'd found faith, that she lived every day with regret, and that she'd, quote, died on the same night as my children, end quote. Her ex-husband, David Smith, spoke against her release. So did others who had lived through the case, and the board denied parole. She remains in prison, but will be eligible again in 2026. 2 children, a town that searched for them, and a story that held a nation spellbound until the truth surfaced. On October 25, 1994, Susan Smith told the world that a stranger had stolen her car and her sons. 9 days later, she told the truth. But 2 little boys were gone forever. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!